We're going to be in Psalm 132 this morning, back in our series on the Songs of Ascents. And as I was kind of thinking about this psalm and preparing this psalm, I guess as both of us were, I'm going to be honest with you, this one is kind of a little weird for the Songs of Ascents. A lot of the Songs of Ascents, they seem like they have a clear purpose or maybe an aspect of God that they're focusing on, and they have a very easy structure to kind of go through and understand. Psalm 132 is not like that. There are times where it seems a little all over the place. There's times where it sort of doubles back on itself, or the structure is kind of hard to understand. And so we focused a lot this week on just trying to understand what is the main point that this psalm is trying to talk to us about. And I think that as I've talked about every time, and you guys are probably bored of hearing about, I was thinking a lot about, again, the point of all of these Songs of Ascents, the idea of all of Israel coming together, coming up towards the temple, and these are the songs they're singing to remind themselves of why their worship is important, to remind themselves of why they do all this collectively as a nation. And when I was thinking about that, I think it made this psalm feel a lot more clear. Because at the very heart of it, even though it does double back on itself a lot, and even though it does have a lot of things going on in it, at the very core of what this psalm is about, it's a psalm about the covenant that God has with His people. It's a psalm about the beauty of worship. It's a psalm about the relationships that not only do the people have with God, but the people have with each other because of their relationship with God. And I think in a lot of ways then it becomes sort of maybe a great example of all of the themes from a lot of the Psalms we've talked about coming together in this one big chunk. And so today we're just going to focus on our covenant with God. We're going to focus on our worship with God, both individually, our relationship with Him, but also collectively, what we're doing here, but also just what we do in general as a church. Do you have anything to say before we get into the first 5 verses here?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I mean, some of these psalms, of course, are attributed maybe to David, Solomon, Asaph, some of that kind of thing. So that also makes it difficult because we don't know who wrote it. We don't know exactly what was going on, in the psalmist's life. That kind of information, you don't have to know that to understand the psalm, but a lot that helps me maybe kind of get more of a one thought or theme. And so for me, that's challenging, I think, with this particular psalm as well.
Yeah, and I mean, like we talked about already, the structure, because it has sort of 4 quotes that sort of divide up the psalm. You have a quote from David in verses 3 through 5, from the people, sort of generally, in verses 7 through 9, and then 2 from God in verses 11 and 12, and in verses 14 through 18. And so trying to put all these pieces together and figure out, well, what is the psalmist trying to tell us with all of this? It can be difficult, but I think we'll be able to get some stuff out of it.
I think so.
You want to take us through the first 5 verses?
Yeah, let's look at verses 1 through 5, and let's think about David's great promise here. The psalm begins by saying, "Remember, O Lord, on David's behalf, all his afflictions, how he swore to the Lord and vowed to the Mighty One of Jacob, surely I will not enter my house, nor lie on my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids, until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the Mighty One of Jacob." So, as I just said, we don't know who wrote this psalm. I don't know when it was written, but apparently it seems to me that it was written sometime after David's reign. David isn't writing this particular psalm. The people of Israel, as they are singing this psalm, if you remember, as Gavin just said, these are songs that would have been sung as they were traveling to Jerusalem, as they were entering into the city to go up to the temple to worship God. They are looking back to the time when David was king. So Psalm 132 begins with Israel asking God to remember David's commitment, his loyalty, I think, to God. I don't think they were asking God to remember in the sense that God had forgotten as if God can forget, but in the sense of wanting to place this before God's mind, before God's eyes, in the sense of wanting him to recall who David was and David's commitment to him. When you think about that, or at least I think about the relationship that existed between God and David, I mean, it's we could say that it's a very close relationship, it's a very intimate relationship. The depth that existed there in that relationship was very great. That this wasn't a casual thing that David entered into with God, or on the other side of that God entered into with David. I believe both of them very much were close to one another. So in asking God to remember them, to remember Israel on David's behalf, the people, I think, are recalling who David was, that David was a person who honored God, David was a person who respected God, David was a person who revered God so much that, as he says here in this quote that Gavin was talking about earlier, verses 3 through 5, that David's commitment to God was so great that he was really uneasy, it seems to me. He was uncomfortable with the fact that here he is, the king of God's people. He knows that God has put him into this position, and he's living in the king's palace. I'm sure it was very luxurious. I'm sure it was a palatial palace, as we might say. He had everything that he needed, while God, if you will, dwelt in a temporary tabernacle, while the Ark of the Covenant was in a temporary structure. I have to think back to 2 Samuel chapter 7 for some things that they are asking God to recall, and I think that they are trying to remember about David. You might remember there in 2 Samuel chapter 6 that the ark was not in Jerusalem, and the people tried to move it in a way that God had not told them to move it, and of course Uzzah was struck dead there. But then later on, the ark is brought into Jerusalem. In chapter 7, we find David's commitment to God and just how strong that commitment was, and how deep his desire was for the Ark of the Covenant to dwell in what he deemed to be an appropriate structure. 2 Samuel 7 verses 1 and 2, it says, "Now it came about when the king lived in his house, and the Lord had given him rest on every side from all his enemies, that the king said to Nathan the prophet, 'See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells within tent curtains.'" So I think this really bothered David. And that speaks volumes to me of who David is, and how concerned David is, not so much for himself and his house and his things, but he is concerned for God and the things of God. So, we can think about that for ourselves. Would we be that concerned? Are we that concerned? When we think about all of the overflow of blessings that we have in our life every day, the luxuries that many of us enjoy, are we more concerned about building our house than God's house? And his uneasiness about that fact was so strong that he promised Jehovah that he wouldn't rest. If you go back here to our Psalm 132, he says, "I'll not enter my house, I'll not lie on my bed, I'll not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for the Lord." I don't know that that's to be taken literally, that David didn't sleep until he died, but in a metaphorical sense, I think this is describing for us his heart and his desire that he's going to put God first. He's going to put God's house first. He's going to put the things of God before the things of his own. To me, that is true commitment. That's a great promise. So, as you think about, kind of back to our beginning observation about this psalm, we don't know a whole lot about it. Whether this Israel, as some people think, sang this song at the dedication of the temple when Solomon, David's son, built the temple, or maybe later on multiple occasions. Surely, I think beginning Psalm 132 with this thought had to have helped focus their minds on what they were doing. To focus their minds on the fact that as hundreds of thousands or millions of God's people are traveling to Jerusalem to worship Him, that they're remembering this is God's house. This is where God dwells, if you will. This is where we meet God. So that's what I see there in verses 1 through 5. You have something to add to that?
Yeah, I think, a lot of the focus on, because I was trying to answer, for myself, why does it open with this focus on David? And then we're going to get back to David later. Mm-hmm. But I think what you were talking about there with the heart of David and his mindset to worship and to give the good things in his life to God, I think that's exactly what this psalm is trying to build on here. The focus isn't just to talk about, David was a great king or a good guy or anything like that. The idea is David, as he was blessed by God, what he wanted to do more than anything else, what his priorities were, was to give of himself to God. And so as we think about all of the people getting ready to worship, they're thinking back to the heart of a good man, someone whose heart was very much with God, and they're drawing on that to inspire themselves to worship.
I think so, and to prepare their own hearts for what they were about to do.
Yeah. Do you mind if I bring us through verses 6 through 9?
No, go ahead.
All right, let's just start by reading them. Behold, we have heard of it in Ephrathah. We found it in the fields of Jair. Let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. Arise, O Lord, and go to your resting place, you and the ark of your might. Let your priest be clothed with righteousness, and let your saints shout for joy. So the way I sort of looked at this is the people are now looking around them and they say, well, David did what he said he was going to do. Or maybe you could say David's descendants did what David said he wanted to do. And we have the temple. The ark is now in a place, a permanent dwelling place, so to speak. And it's now time for all of us to go over there. It's now time for us, for all the people from all the fields and all the hill country of all Israel to gather together to this special place that David promised so long ago. And so it kind of starts with almost saying, well, our end of the deal is done. But notice they ask for a sort of, I guess, extra blessings from God. First they ask, okay, since we're going to go meet you at your place, we're going to go towards where your temple, your house, your ark is. They ask in verse 8 for God to meet them there, which I think in some ways I would almost think would be a given. This is the place where God says, this is where my ark is going to be. This is my resting place. This is where the presence of the Lord is. But the people here are saying, well, if we're going to assemble from all over Israel, if we're going to come towards you, we ask that you make your presence be there, that you draw near to us. And then they ask for increased blessings there as they focus on the priest and also the people, saying the priests help them to be clothed with righteousness. Of course, I don't have to tell you, the priests are integral to any worship of God under the old law. They represent sort of the spiritual leaders of the people. And so here this psalm is a prayer asking that they are given a right relationship with God, that they are blessed with closeness to Him. And of course, as the psalm immediately turns around and says, that's going to have wonderful consequences for the people. Because if the priests, these spiritual servants, are clothed in righteousness, then all the people are going to find joy in their faith. And I think that that's an amazing idea there in verse 9. To let your saints shout for joy as they come into your presence. Because if you sort of have this picture, so they ask, we're coming to you, God, please draw near to us and let us find joy in that. Let us find happiness, contentment in worshiping you, in drawing near to you. It's not just asking that the priest and the people are faithful, although that is an important and an amazing thing. Help them love to be faithful. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember. I think sometimes maybe we get almost in a parent-child mindset with God. And I know when I was a kid, there was a lot of things that I did for my parents because they told me to. I didn't want to do them. I didn't love doing it, but I did it because I had to. I think sometimes we almost have that view of a relationship with God is, okay, well, I love God, and He's told me all these things I have to do to be faithful, and so I'll do it. I'm not going to like it, but I'll do it. That's not the idea at all of Psalm 132. The prayer there is help the people to love their walk of faith. Help them to shout for joy because they have the ability to be faithful and the ability to draw near to God and worship. That's a completely flipped idea. The idea of, I just love God so much that I am thankful for the ability to draw closer to Him. I am thankful for the ability to grow in living more like Him. And so I think that's just a beautiful idea, and I think it comes down to really help the people and the priests have the same heart that David had. Help them be a part of the same covenant that David enjoyed. Help them to be faithful, help them to enjoy being faithful, and help them to draw near just like your servants of old have. And I think that's just beautiful. Do you have anything?
That's really what I was thinking in this whole section, that it may seem strange again to us why they start this psalm, why the psalm starts with the example of David and his words and his promise to God a long time ago. But I think they're holding up David's example and saying, we want to follow his example. Mm-hmm. We want to be like him. We want to have the same heart he had. We want to have show the same commitment to God that he had. We want to show the same reverence for God. Mm-hmm. We want to do things God's way, and we want to meet him in his house. So I think they are really following through on that, maybe somewhat of an answer, a little bit of what was said back in the first 5 verses.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the idea is now that we have this temple and those sets of promises are fulfilled, now all of the people can sort of join in that covenant with God that David was in. And it's a sort of, I think, as we see, and we're going to see even clearer as we go through the rest of the psalm, the promises of God sort of getting bigger and expanding and getting more full as the story gets told.
That's right. So we'll move on into verses 10 through 12 here. So we talked in verses 1 through 5, or at least I looked at that opening section as describing for us David's great promise, and it is a great promise. It's a sacrifice that David was willing to make, a great sacrifice for God. But then God turns around and He makes an even greater promise to David and to his descendants and even to us. Notice here in verse 10, He says, "For the sake of David your servant, do not turn away the face of your anointed. The Lord has sworn to David a truth from which He will not turn back. Of the fruit of your body I will set upon your throne. If your sons will keep my covenant and my testimony which I will teach them, their sons also shall sit upon your throne forever." So, again, as the people are approaching God here in this psalm, they at the beginning ask Him to remember David. Here at verse 10, as I think Gavin pointed out a minute ago, we have David at the beginning. We have David here kind of in the middle of the psalm at this next section. But they're asking God to remember them. They're asking God to remember them, including their current king, if that's who is in mind here specifically about not turning away the face of your anointed. But they're asking God, I think, to act on their behalf for David's sake because of who David is. And as Gavin already pointed out, to join them as they are worshiping God in the temple. The psalmist again turns our minds to this committed relationship between God and David. He doesn't just mention it there at verse 1, but he reminds us of how strong this commitment was and this relationship was, that David had sworn to God. He had made an oath to God, and here was God turning around making an oath to David. And I believe this oath, this promise that God made here, as we have the quotation, is really God's answer, I think, to David's desire to build a house for him. So you think about that promise we just talked about a few minutes ago from verses 1 through 5. That promise that David made to God in those verses is certainly a great promise. It wasn't something to be taken lightly. It wasn't a little thing in the eyes of God. And yet, God's promise here in this section to David, and really God's promise to all Israel, and even God's promise involving us today, is so much greater, because not only would a temple for God be built in Jerusalem, it had already been built, I think, when this psalm was written, certainly Solomon building that, but God would also give David and his descendants a house, or if you will, a temple, a house, a lineage that would last forever. So I want you to go back again. I should have told you to maybe keep your thumb there at 2 Samuel 7, but to look at the promises of God. 2 Samuel chapter 7, let's read here beginning at verse 12. And this is God's answer to what David desired to do for him. He says, when your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendant after you who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men. But my loving kindness shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, when I removed whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. So David comes to God and says, I want to build a temple for you. God says, you're not going to do that. Your descendant will, but I'm going to go not just one up. But he took that promise up several ratchets, I think, and said, I'm going to bless you greater than you can even imagine. And the blessing won't just be for you. It won't be for your family, just for the line of kings that would come from you. But he says it'll be for all Israel will benefit from this, and even for us today. So while God's promise there in 2 Samuel 7, it would find an initial partial fulfillment in Solomon, obviously, and in David's lineage in the kings of Judah in the future, I believe it would have an ultimate and greater fulfillment in Jesus Christ, that he is our king. He is the one whom God has sent. He is the one who started a kingdom that will last forever. It can never be overthrown. It can never be destroyed. It can never be overtaken by a foreign enemy. It's going to last forever. And so that certainly should bring us joy as we worship God today, to think about that fact that God has put his Son as king in the kingdom that we are citizens of. And we don't have to worry about that kingdom going away, because it is going to be a kingdom that lasts forever. How grateful I think we all should be when we come to worship God, especially, that God made such a great promise to David, but also God made such a great promise to us. That's what I see there in those three verses.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, these verses sort of have to look back and have to look forward. And so, I mean, like you said, it looks back towards that promise that God gave to David there. But all of the promise are things that still apply to us and are a great reminder both to the people that would have originally been reading and singing Psalm 132, but also for us. God is faithful. And like you said, God's promises are not like our promises. God's promises are so much bigger and more expansive than we could even imagine. And that's exactly what you see here. God is so faithful that he gave us a better, amazing king. And that's just great news to God's holy people. And I think that leads directly into verse 13 and through the rest of the psalm. So if you're with us there, let's just finish out reading the psalm together, starting in verse 13. For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling place. This is my resting place forever, and here will I dwell, for I have desired it. I will abundantly bless her provisions. I will satisfy her poor with bread. Her priests I will clothe with salvation, and her saints will shout for joy. There I will make a horn to sprout for David. I have prepared a lamp for my anointed. His enemies I will clothe with shame, but on him his crown will shine. And so if you think, I mean, we're sort of tying all of the bows up of all of the threads that we've had really throughout the psalm here. God goes back to talk about Zion, that place where his presence is, that resting place. And here he focuses on it as a place that he chooses to rest at. Not that God needs a resting place. He makes that abundantly clear to David in 2 Samuel 7, that God doesn't need an earthly home, but God has chosen his people, and he's chosen to love and to bless his people and the land that he's given them. And these blessings are amazing. In verse 15, I'm going to bless her with plenty of food, which maybe is not something that to us is that astounding. I mean, you go to the supermarket and you just got shelves and shelves and shelves and shelves of food, but we're spoiled. I mean, this was not a blessing that any nation really had in the time that this psalm was written. This idea of you're going to have way more than you can even possibly need. Even the poorest among you are going to know where their meals came from. And then sort of I see in verse 16 an answer to what the people asked for, because in verse 9 they ask, let your priests be clothed with righteousness, let your saints shout for joy. That idea we had earlier of not just being faithful, but loving being faithful. And then here in verse 16, God announces, her priest I will clothe with salvation, and her saints will shout for joy. Essentially, God turning around and saying, you know what? I'm going to do exactly what you asked me to do. I'm going to draw near to you. I'm going to give you that beautiful, blessed relationship with me, and you're going to find joy and love in following me. But then it's almost like, but not just that. Wait, there's more. And he continues on, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do exactly what I said I'm going to do for David. I'm going to continue to bring light through my anointed. I'm going to continue to judge evil, but also to bless my people. And really what I see all through this is just God's amazing love that he has for the people. God's amazing desire to bless his covenant people. God just wants so much to give them, through his relationship with them, joy. Much more than they even asked for. And I think it does draw on that idea of what a covenant is. And we've talked about this some over the last few weeks, but I think maybe a covenant is another one of those words that we really need to think about more than we do. God is sort of saying here in these verses that the greatest blessing that he can possibly give his people, even though there is going to be the food and the protection and all of those things, but it comes back to over and over again his relationship with them. It's almost like God saying, the best thing I can possibly do for you, it's not the food, it's not the safety, it's not even those things. Those are great things. Those are important things. But what God comes back to over and over again is the best thing I can possibly give you is a fulfilled relationship with me. The best thing I can possibly give you is nearness to me. The best thing I can possibly do is to be in your presence. And I think about that with us. Sometimes we sing the hymn, He is in our midst. And we know that. We know that when we come together, that we are coming towards God. We are drawing near to Him, and He is drawing near to us. He's here with us. I think maybe we know that. But do you think about how impactful that is? Do you think about how amazing that is that God has chosen to bless us with His presence? And you get to be here for it. You get to draw near to the Creator, the Lord of all things. And He desires you to do that. And it's almost like when God speaks in Psalm 132, He's almost like, I can't think of a better gift to give you than a closeness with me. And so what I see as an emphasis throughout really all of these 18 verses is that covenant relationship, that idea of God saying, I am faithful to you. I am always going to be faithful and loving to you. And what I desire more than anything is for you to meet me where I'm at. And we can have that amazing relationship where I will be your God and you will be my people. And I think that's just beautiful.
Yeah, and I think that word desire is what I really focused on.
Yeah.
Here in this section, the closing section, God says, He has desired it for His habitation, talking about God choosing Zion. And then God saying, here I will dwell, for I have desired it. Mm-hmm. And to think earlier in this psalm, like we already talked about, David's desire for God, the people's desire here on this occasion to join God in worship, but here's God reciprocating that. And even more so than what they're asking for, and God desiring to join us in worship. Now that's that ought to be a humbling thought to us. That ought to almost blow our minds that, yes, we ought to desire to join God in worship, but God desires to join with us. He wants there to be this closeness. He wants there to be this open relationship when we come before Him in worship. Mm-hmm. And it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Well, why don't we wrap it up? I just put all the applications on one screen. So you want to start with it?
Sure. I think there are lots of applications here in this psalm. The one that I've chosen is the first one here on the screen, that as we think about ourselves today, as we think about Psalm 132, the temple imagery that is obviously used here throughout this psalm, that we are God's temple today, if we are God's children, if we are God's people. And as His temple, we're joining God in worship. It doesn't matter whether we are doing that individually, one-on-one with God, or whether we're doing that as we are doing this morning collectively together. There are some differences. Unlike Israel, we don't have to travel to a physical place. We don't have to travel to a specific structure like the people travel to the temple to worship God, because we are His temple. And I think the New Testament makes that very clear. We are the dwelling place of God, both collectively and individually. Some of you might be thinking already about some things that Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, we're not going to take the time to read these verses, verse 9, verses 16 and 17. Paul reminds, I think, in a collective sense, the church there in Corinth, that you are the temple of God. You are something that is holy, that is set apart for God. You are God's dwelling place, and someone who tries to mess with that or to destroy that, God will bring His punishment upon that person. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, as he's talking to us about our physical bodies and how we need to take care of them and honor them and use them in a way that God intended for them to be used, he reminds us at the end of that discussion in 1 Corinthians 6 that you are the temple of the Holy Spirit. He is in you. And therefore you need to glorify God in your body. And so both individually and collectively, we are God's temple. To think about God's temple today, it's not just composed of Israelites, Jews. It's composed of everyone who follows Jesus. One passage I do want to take you to just very quickly to think about this temple imagery, and for us being a temple today, I think that ties a lot of these thoughts, at least thoughts in my mind, together from Psalm 132, is found in the book of Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians chapter 2, where Paul has already reminded us of who we all were at the first 3 verses, that we were all dead in sin, and we needed God to rescue us, and God did that because He's rich in mercy and He extended His grace to us through Jesus Christ. But then he talks specifically, I think, to Gentiles and reminds them that before Christ came, they were alienated from God. They were not connected to the promises, the covenants of God. But then he draws them back in. Notice here in Ephesians chapter 2, beginning at verse 18, he says, "For through Him, through Christ, we both have our access, both Jew and Gentile, in one Spirit to the Father. So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and are of God's household, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus Himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole building being fitted together is growing into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together into a dwelling of God in the Spirit." I hope you were impressed with just the imagery that's used there. Paul talks about a building, a household, a structure, a temple of God. And all of us are God's temple today. So here's the one thing that I took away, or I want you to think about from this psalm, that every time we worship God, not just when we come to this building a few hours a week, but I think every time we worship God, individually and collectively, publicly and privately, that because we are the temple of God today, we are communing with Him. We are joining with Him. And He is certainly an awesome, awesome God. Sometimes it can be easy for us to just come, maybe especially in our collective worship like we are this morning, to come here and just kind of mindlessly go through all the motions. Do we ever think about God while we're here? I mean, maybe that seems like a silly question to ask, but we're here to join God in worship. Do we think about God? Because I am confident that God is thinking about us, not just when we're gathered together like we are this morning, but He's thinking about us all the time. And so we need to see that connection, I think, that relationship that is always there.
Yeah, I thought about something very similar. If you want to turn to Romans 12, I'm going to read a few verses there. You may have forgotten that we had a theme verse for this series, and you probably forgot that because me and Jacob have forgotten to mention it since February. So we'll forgive you if you'll forgive us. But we're going to be in Romans 12, and I want to just read the same two verses that Brother Todd read for us at the beginning of service today. It says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. A lot of the times when the New Testament uses the imagery of the worship of the Old Testament, like he does here with the idea of sacrifice, they're applying it not just to what we do physically, although that is true, but it's what we do in our hearts and our minds. And I see a lot of that in Psalm 132. The idea that it's not just that God desires his people to live out his word, although he absolutely does. God desires his people to want him. And so when I was sort of thinking about Romans 12, he does say to present your bodies as a living sacrifice. But then he follows that right back around and says, and here's how you start doing that. And it starts with changing the way you think, changing the way you feel. And so when I looked back into Psalm 132, I saw that idea that we've talked about a few times now, that idea of covenant love. That idea of our relationship with God is not built on material goods. It's not built on maybe a lot of the physical things that some of our other relationships are built on. God wants our hearts. He wants faith. He wants love. He wants righteousness, that relationship with him. And so really, as God boils down a lot of the themes that we've talked about throughout the year, God boils down this idea of worship. He boils it down to, I want you to have a relationship with me, and I want you to want to have a relationship with me. And so, and then God turns around and says, and if you do that, if your hearts are with me, you're going to have more blessings. It's going to be more amazing than you can possibly even imagine. But I just want you to give me your heart. And then the other thing I sort of thought about is as God talks about all the amazing blessings that come with that relationship with him, there is just no better life than the life of a Christian. And I don't think we say that enough. I think we do very good preaching about how being a Christian is hard sometimes, and it is. That's true. Or how the pressures of the world are there, and that's difficult, and that's true. But I think we forget to talk about how incredibly blessed we are to have a covenant relationship with God. Sometimes we get that idea that maybe kind of, being a Christian's not really great or easy right now, but someday it's going to be absolutely worth it eternally. God says, no, hold on. It's worth it and it's great right now. Your relationship with me is worth everything you're having to endure right now because of the love and the mercy and the grace I'm continually showing you, with the fact that you're able to grow closer to me, that we're drawing near towards each other. God says the life of a Christian is the best life you can live on earth right now. You don't have to wait for heaven to have all the eternal blessings of God. He says that starts with your life right now. No one has it better than a Christian. And I think we need to believe that more. I think we need to say that more. Psalm 132 tells us God's promises are an amazing thing. He's given us his presence. He's given us Jesus in our lives right now. And God's reaching out to us and saying, I want to bless you bigger and better than you can possibly imagine, starting now. The life of a Christian is amazing, and we need to remember that. Because if we truly believe God is fully faithful to his word, and I think we all believe that, then we need to believe we don't have to wait for eternity to feel the blessings of God. because God says they're here with you in this room right now. That's all I have. You want to close us out?
There's definitely a lot here in Psalm 132. It is a rich psalm, one of the longest psalms of the Songs of Ascents, with just so many powerful truths for us to absorb and to try to live out in our life. As we close our lesson this morning, we do, as we always do, to extend the invitation of Jesus Christ. Some of you may have seen the advertisement, I think it was a long, long time ago, even before my time, with our military in this country that said, Uncle Sam wants you. And I really think that is, by and large, the message of Psalm 132, that God wants you. God wants you. He wants your heart. He wants all of you. He wants you to make the choice to decide to come to Him. He desires you, and He wants to know you and wants to have a relationship with you. And you can start that this morning. If you're a believer in Jesus, you believe that He is the Christ, the Son of God, you can come this morning confessing that belief before this assembly and repenting of your sins, turning away from your old lifestyle and giving your life and your heart to God. And we will be thrilled to baptize you into Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of your sins and to start you on that journey this very hour. If you need to do that, or if you need to come back to God, if you've strayed from Him because of sin, whatever your need might be, let us know how we can help you. Come to the front as we stand and as we sing.